The morning fog clung to the hills of Marin County, like a memory refusing to fade. Elena Morales adjusted her grip on the steering wheel as she turned through the wrought iron gates of the Ashworth estate, the GPS on her phone finally falling silent after 40 minutes of winding roads through some of California's most exclusive territory. At 52, Eleanor had cleaned enough wealthy homes to recognize the signs. The longer the driveway, the deeper the loneliness inside. This one stretched for nearly a quarter mile, lined with ancient oaks that formed a cathedral of shadows and filtered sunlight. The house materialized through the mist like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. Mediterranean architecture married to modern glass, 22 rooms perched on a cliff overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Worth $38 million, according to the real estate magazines that still featured it 2 years after the tragedy. Eleanor parked her 12-year-old Honda beside the service entrance, gathered her supplies from the trunk, and took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air. She'd taken this job for the same reason she'd taken every job for the past 8 years: survival. But something about this place felt different, weighted with a grief so thick she could taste it on her tongue. The kitchen door was already unlocked. Mrs. Chen, the house manager, had left instructions in broken English mixed with precise scheduling. Elena tied her apron, reviewed the day's list clipped to the refrigerator, and began the familiar ritual of making herself invisible. Room by room, she moved through the mansion like a ghost, polishing marble that already gleamed, dusting antiques that gathered no dust, maintaining the illusion of perfection in a house where perfection had died along with its mistress. It was in the solarium, while cleaning the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the bay, that Eleanor first saw him. 7-year-old Cameron Ashworth sat motionless beneath a Japanese maple tree, his small frame folded in on itself like origami made from sorrow. Even from this distance, Elena could see the rigidity in his posture, the way he held himself apart from the world, as if touch itself might cause him to shatter. She'd read about him in the hiring briefing, the boy who hadn't spoken since watching his mother drown in their infinity pool 18 months ago. Sophia Ashworth, former ballet dancer turned philanthropist, had suffered a seizure while swimming laps on a Tuesday morning. By the time the gardener found her, it was too late. Cameron had been the one to discover them both. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the child who sat as still as sculpture. She knew that kind of stillness, had lived inside it once, when loss carved out pieces of your soul and left you hollow. 23 years ago, her own son Diego had been Cameron's age when the immigration authorities took him. She'd been working without papers, cleaning office buildings in downtown Oakland at night, sending money back to her mother in Guadalajara, trying to build a life from nothing. When ICE raided her apartment complex, Diego was at school. By the time she was released from detention 3 months later, he'd been placed with a foster family in Sacramento who refused to let her see him. The courts said she was unfit. The lawyers said she had no rights. The system said she didn't matter. She never saw Diego again. Elena pulled her hand away from the window, leaving a ghost print on the glass that she immediately wiped clean. Some stories, she'd learned, were too heavy to carry in the open air, but as she watched Cameron sit in his garden prison, she recognized the shape of his grief. It looked like her own. The bucket she used for outdoor surfaces sloshed as she carried it to the stone patio. The mixture of Castile soap and white vinegar created a film of bubbles on the surface, a practical cleaning solution that reminded her of childhood summers in Guadalajara, when her grandmother would let her wash dishes in the courtyard fountain. Las burbujas llevan los deseos al cielo, abuela used to say. Bubbles carry wishes to heaven. Elena glanced toward Cameron, still motionless under his tree, and felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was dead. Without planning it, without considering the consequences, she dipped her fingers into the soapy water and lifted them to her lips. One gentle breath, and a single bubble emerged, catching the morning light like a tiny planet made of hope. Cameron's head lifted so slowly, she almost missed it. His dark eyes, so much like his mother's in the family photographs that lined the hallways, tracked the bubble's lazy journey across the garden. When it popped against a leaf, something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, but awareness. a flicker of engagement with the world beyond his internal fortress. Elena blew another bubble. This time Cameron watched from beginning to end, following its path until it disappeared beyond the garden wall. When he looked back at her, their eyes met across the distance, and for just a moment, the weight in the air seemed to lighten. Then he looked away, but he didn't retreat. He simply settled deeper into his spot beneath the tree, as if deciding that this particular patch of earth had become a little bit safer. From his home office on the 3rd floor, Marcus Ashworth paused in his review of quarterly reports, his attention caught by movement on the security monitor that showed the East Garden. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. His son was outside, nothing unusual there. Cameron spent most of his waking hours in the garden, as far from the house and its memories as he could manage while still being technically supervised. But today, he wasn't alone. The new cleaning woman, Elena, according to the service invoice, was working near the fountain, and Cameron was watching her. Actually watching, with the kind of focused attention he hadn't shown in months. Marcus reached for the Zoom controls, his morning coffee growing cold as he studied the screen. The woman was blowing bubbles from her cleaning bucket, something so simple and innocent that it shouldn't have mattered. But Cameron was following each one with his eyes, tracking their flight patterns like they contained messages only he could read. Marcus had spent 18 months and over $200,000 on child psychologists, trauma specialists and behavioral therapists. The parade of experts had offered theories and techniques, medications and methodologies, but none of them had managed to draw even a flicker of genuine interest from his son. And now this woman, this undocumented immigrant who probably hadn't finished high school, was capturing Cameron's attention with soap bubbles. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, unsure whether to feel grateful or insulted. He'd built his fortune on understanding markets, predicting human behavior, reading the subtle signs that separated success from failure. But grief, he was learning, followed no logical patterns. On the monitor, Elena continued her work while blowing an occasional bubble. Cameron remained in his spot, no longer staring at the ground, but watching the sky, waiting for the next small miracle to float into view. For the first time in months, Marcus saw his son engaged with something beyond his own pain. And despite his confusion, despite his pride, despite all the rational objections forming in his mind, he felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The next morning arrived grey and uncertain, typical for Marin County in late spring. Elena drove through the gates 15 minutes early, a habit formed from years of public transportation that didn't wait for anyone. But as she parked beside the service entrance, she found herself glancing toward the East Garden before she could stop herself. Cameron was already there. Same spot, same tree, same posture of careful isolation. But there was something different in the way he sat, a subtle alertness, as if he were listening for something specific. Elena felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or fear, or the dangerous territory where the two intersected. She went through her morning routine: coffee for the automatic pot Mr. Chen had programmed, review of the day's tasks, gathering of supplies, but found herself moving faster than usual, driven by a pull she didn't want to examine too closely. When she stepped onto the patio with her bucket and supplies, Cameron's head turned immediately, not toward her exactly, but toward the space where she'd been yesterday, where the bubbles had come from. Eleanor set down her bucket and began the familiar motions of preparing to clean the stone surface. The soapy mixture frothed and bubbled, and without allowing herself to overthink it, she dipped her fingers and blew gently. A single bubble emerged, wobbling uncertainly in the still air. Cameron watched it rise, his whole body focused on its journey. When it popped, he looked at Elena directly, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch: expectation. She blew another bubble, then another. By the fourth one, Cameron had shifted position slightly, not closer, but more open, his body turned toward her instead of away. This became their morning ritual. Eleanor would clean, blowing bubbles at irregular intervals. Cameron would watch, tracking each one until it vanished. Neither of them spoke. That wasn't their language yet. But something was being communicated in the space between breath and soap, between watching and being seen. On the third day, Cameron brought something with him to the garden, a sketch pad and a box of colored pencils. While Eleanor worked, he drew with careful concentration, glancing up whenever a bubble appeared, but returning quickly to his paper. Elena found herself curious about his artwork, but forced herself to maintain distance. She'd learned the hard way that pushing too fast, wanting too much, could shatter the most delicate connections. On the fifth day, everything changed. Cameron had been drawing for nearly an hour when Elena noticed him studying his work with unusual intensity. Finally, he stood, the first time she'd seen him voluntarily leave his spot, and walked to the edge of the patio. Without looking at Elena directly, he placed the sketch pad on the stone surface between them and stepped back. Elena approached slowly, aware that this was some kind of offering, some tentative bridge being built. When she saw what he'd drawn, her breath caught in her throat. The paper was covered with bubbles, dozens of them, rendered in soft pastels and careful detail. Each one was unique, some large, some small, some perfectly round, others elongated by imaginary breezes. At the bottom of the page, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, he'd written a single word: dreams. Elena looked up to find Cameron watching her reaction with anxious intensity. She could feel the weight of the moment, the trust being offered, the fragile hope that his gift might be understood and accepted. Es hermoso, she whispered, then caught herself. But Cameron's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed to relax slightly, as if her natural language felt safer than the English that surrounded him in this house of grief. Eleanor knelt beside the drawing, studying each bubble with the seriousness it deserved. Then, moving slowly so as not to startle him, she pulled her own small notebook from her apron pocket, the one where she kept grocery lists and appointment reminders, and sketched a simple bubble of her own. Not to match his skill, but to mirror his gesture, to show him that his offering had been received and honored. Cameron stepped closer, just one step, but it felt monumental. He pointed to her drawing, then to his own, then looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Eleanor nodded and drew another bubble on a fresh page, this one slightly larger than the first. Cameron studied it, then added his own bubble to the corner of her paper, a small, perfectly round circle that seemed to float beside hers. They were no longer strangers sharing the same space. They were collaborators, building something beautiful together out of soap and air, and the courage to reach across the silence that had held them both captive. From his office window, Marcus watched the exchange with a mixture of wonder and unease. His son, the boy who hadn't engaged with anyone since the accident, who flinched away from therapists and turned to stone around relatives, was sharing artwork with the cleaning woman. Marcus zoomed in on the security feed, studying Elena's face as she examined Cameron's drawing. There was no condescension there, no adult pretense of finding children's art cute. She looked at it with genuine attention, as if Cameron had handed her something precious, which Marcus realized he had. Marcus had Cameron's drawings from before the accident, confident, joyful sketches of dogs and spaceships and family portraits where everyone smiled with enormous teeth. But those drawings had stopped the day Sophia died, replaced by months of blank paper and abandoned art supplies. Now Cameron was drawing again, not just drawing but sharing, creating something that required hope, however tentative. Marcus closed his laptop and walked to the window that offered a direct view of the garden. Eleanor had returned to her cleaning, but every few minutes she would pause to blow a bubble. Cameron had settled back under his tree, but he continued to add details to his drawing, glancing up to track each floating sphere. For 18 months, Marcus had been looking for signs of healing in all the wrong places. He'd wanted breakthrough moments, verbal progress, measurable improvement. But maybe healing looked like this: a boy who chose to stand up, to walk forward, to share something beautiful with someone who saw its value. Marcus made a decision that surprised him. Instead of returning to his desk, he walked downstairs and out to the garden. Eleanor looked up as he approached, her expression immediately shifting to the careful, neutral mask he'd seen on the faces of staff members for years. But Cameron didn't seem surprised by his father's appearance. If anything, He held up his drawing as if to include Marcus in whatever moment was unfolding. "That's beautiful, buddy," Marcus said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Tell me about it." Cameron didn't speak. Marcus hadn't expected him to, but he pointed to different bubbles on the page, then to Elena, then to the sky, as if explaining the connection between all three. Elena cleared her throat softly. "He's been watching," she said, her accent flavoring the words, but her meaning perfectly clear. "Every morning, he watches." "I know," Marcus replied, then realized this might sound like criticism. "I mean, I've seen, on the monitors. I've been watching, too." Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a lessening of wariness. "He has good eyes," she said, "for beautiful things." Cameron looked between them, perhaps sensing that something important was happening in the adult conversation above his head. Then, with the directness that only children possess, he pointed to Elena's bucket and made a soft, whooshing sound with his lips. Elena smiled, the first real smile Marcus had seen from her, and blew another bubble without hesitation. All three of them watched it rise, following its path until it disappeared beyond the garden wall. In that moment, something tentative but real passed between them, the recognition that this small ritual mattered, that Cameron's healing might come not from experts and interventions, but from connection and patience and the simple magic of paying attention. Marcus had built his career on complex deals and strategic thinking, but standing in his garden, watching his son find joy in soap bubbles, he began to understand that the most important things in life might also be the simplest. Summer settled over Marin County like a warm blanket, and with it came changes so subtle they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely. But Marcus had become an expert observer of small shifts, tiny movements toward the light that marked his son's slow return to the world. Cameron no longer waited in the same spot every morning. Instead, he would arrive in the garden early and choose his position based on the wind direction, the angle of the sun, the mysterious calculations of a 7-year-old who had become a connoisseur of bubble flight patterns. Elena, for her part, had stopped pretending the bubbles were accidental. She now carried a small bottle of bubble solution in her apron pocket, not the harsh cleaning mixture, but gentle soap specifically designed for the delicate spheres that had become their shared language. The transformation was gradual enough to avoid scrutiny from the other staff. Mrs. Chen, the house manager, noted approvingly that the young master seemed calmer these days. The gardener mentioned that Cameron no longer retreated when he worked nearby. The cook reported that the boy's appetite had improved, though he still ate most of his meals in silence. But Marcus, watching from his office window each morning, saw the deeper changes. Cameron had begun to anticipate Elena's arrival, positioning himself where he could see the service entrance. When she appeared, his entire posture would shift, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Shoulders relaxing, head lifting, hands unclenching. The artwork had evolved too. Cameron's drawings now filled multiple sketch pads, each page devoted to different aspects of bubble study, the way light refracted through soap films, the geometric patterns that appeared just before bursting, the various trajectories that bubbles took depending on weather conditions. Eleanor had begun bringing her own contributions, not drawings, but small gifts that connected to their shared interest. A prism that cast rainbows when held to the light, a magnifying glass for examining the swirling patterns on bubble surfaces, a book about surface tension that she'd found at a used bookstore, with pictures clear enough to transcend language barriers. They still rarely spoke directly. Elena's English was functional but limited, and Cameron's silence remained largely intact. But they had developed an intricate communication system of gestures, shared glances, and collaborative creation that felt more intimate than most conversations. It was on a particularly warm Thursday morning in July that everything shifted again. Eleanor had just blown a series of bubbles when Cameron stood up suddenly, not with his usual deliberate movements but with an urgency that made her heart skip. He jogged to where she stood, the first time she'd seen him run since starting work at the house, and tugged gently on her apron. "¿Qué pasa, mijo?" Elena asked instinctively, then caught herself. But Cameron didn't seem bothered by the Spanish. If anything, he looked relieved to hear her natural voice, instead of the careful English she used around other staff members. Cameron pointed to her bottle of bubble solution, then to his own hands, making the same gentle blowing motion she'd demonstrated countless times. Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was a request for participation, not just observation, a crossing of the invisible line that had separated them for months. She unscrewed the bottle cap and dipped the wand, then held it out to Cameron. He accepted it with the gravity of someone receiving a sacred object, studied the soap film stretched across the plastic circle, and brought it carefully to his lips. His first attempt was too forceful. The film broke without forming a bubble. Cameron's face fell, and Elena quickly intervened. "Suave," she said softly, demonstrating with her own breath how gentle the exhalation needed to be. "Como un suspiro." Like a sigh. Cameron tried again, this time barely breathing across the wand's surface. A perfect bubble emerged, small but complete, and his face lit up with joy so pure that Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Sky," Cameron whispered, so quietly Elena almost missed it. But she didn't miss it. The word hung in the air between them, as delicate and precious as the bubble floating toward the Japanese maple. Elena's hand flew to her heart, but she forced herself to remain calm, to not overwhelm this moment with adult excitement. Instead, she nodded and pointed upward. "Si, cielo," she agreed. "Sky." Cameron looked at her directly then, really looked, and Elena saw something she hadn't expected: recognition, not just of her presence, but of her understanding. He had spoken, and she had heard him, not just the word, but the trust behind it. From that day forward, their morning ritual expanded. Cameron would arrive early, but instead of waiting passively, he would help prepare the bubble solution, test the wind conditions, and position himself strategically for optimal viewing. Elena would create bubbles, but now Cameron created them too, both of them studying the results with the intensity of scientists conducting experiments. And slowly, carefully, Cameron began to add more words to their shared vocabulary. Big one. Higher. Gone. Simple phrases that described their floating world, but carried the weight of a child choosing to rejoin the realm of communication. Elena responded to each word as if it were a gift, repeating it back to confirm she'd heard, sometimes offering the Spanish equivalent, always maintaining the gentle rhythm that had brought them this far. Marcus, watching from his window, felt something crack open in his chest. His son was speaking, not to therapists or teachers or family members, but to a woman who cleaned their house and saw beauty in soap bubbles. The realization should have stung, but instead it filled him with gratitude so profound he had to sit down. Cameron was healing. Not according to any timeline or methodology Marcus understood, but according to his own deep wisdom about what felt safe and what felt real. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He cancelled the appointment with Cameron's newest child psychologist, a specialist in selective mutism, who came highly recommended and charged accordingly. Instead, he walked down to the garden where Eleanor was gathering her cleaning supplies, and Cameron was carefully returning the bubble wands to their designated spot. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of humility, "could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, immediately alert to the tone that suggested this wasn't about scheduling or household logistics. "Si, signor," she replied, but Marcus caught the slight stiffening in her posture. Cameron, however, seemed unconcerned by his father's presence. He continued organizing his art supplies with the same methodical care he brought to everything these days. "I wanted to say thank you," Marcus began, then stopped, realizing how inadequate the words sounded. "What you've done with Cameron, what you've given him." Elena waited, her expression unreadable. "I don't understand how it works," Marcus continued, gesturing toward the garden where evidence of their daily ritual was scattered across the patio. "But I can see that it does work. He's different, better, more himself than he's been since—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Elena nodded as if she understood. "He needed someone to see him," she said simply. "Not to fix him, just to see him." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. For 18 months he'd been trying to repair his son like a broken machine, hiring experts to identify the malfunction and implement corrections. But Cameron wasn't broken. He was grieving. And grief, Eleanor seemed to understand, required witness more than intervention. "Would you—" Marcus started, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase what he was asking. "Would you consider spending more time with him, not as cleaning staff, but as— I don't know what to call it." Elena studied his face, perhaps looking for signs of the catch that always came with offers from wealthy employers. "Just time," Marcus clarified. "Whatever this is that you two have built together, I don't want to interfere with it, but I don't want it to end when the cleaning is finished each day." Cameron, who had been pretending not to listen to the adult conversation, looked up sharply at this. Eleanor glanced at the boy, then back at Marcus. "What would the others say?" she asked. "Mrs. Chen, the other staff." "I don't care what they say," Marcus replied, and meant it. "I care about Cameron, and Cameron cares about you." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Cameron walked over and took Elena's hand. Not clinging, not desperate, just a simple gesture of connection that spoke louder than any argument Marcus could have made. Elena looked down at the small hand in hers, then up at Marcus with something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Está bien," she said quietly. "We can try." The arrangement that began as an informal extension of Cameron's morning routine gradually evolved into something more substantial and, for Elena, more complex. Marcus had suggested she stay through lunch, spending the afternoon hours in the garden with Cameron instead of moving on to her other cleaning jobs. The pay was better than her usual rate, and the work was certainly easier than scrubbing office bathrooms or wrestling with industrial vacuum cleaners. But Elena had learned to be wary of situations that seemed too good to be true. In her experience, wealthy employers who offered kindness often expected gratitude that extended beyond the terms of employment. Still, watching Cameron's continued emergence from his shell of silence, she found it impossible to say no. Their afternoon sessions took on a different character than the morning bubble rituals. Without the pressure of maintaining the pretense that Elena was primarily there to clean, they settled into a more natural rhythm of companionship. Cameron would show Elena his extensive collection of drawings, explaining in his slowly expanding vocabulary the specific qualities that made each bubble unique. Elena would listen with the careful attention she'd once given to Diego's elaborate explanations of playground politics and superhero hierarchies. Sometimes they would sit quietly, Cameron drawing while Eleanor mended the tears in his clothing, a skill she'd learned from her grandmother and maintained through years of making do with too little. Cameron seemed fascinated by the way she could make broken things whole again with nothing more than thread and patience. Other times, Elena would tell Cameron stories from her childhood in Guadalajara. Not the difficult parts, the poverty, the hunger, the dangerous journey north, but the magical parts. The festival of lights that filled the plaza each December. The way her grandmother could make the most beautiful paper flowers from newspaper and wire. The stray cat who had appointed himself guardian of their apartment building and somehow always knew which children needed comfort on any given day. Cameron absorbed these stories with the intensity he brought to everything that interested him. Sometimes he would draw scenes from Elena's descriptions, the plaza filled with lights, the grandmother's patient hands, the wise cat perched on a windowsill. Eleanor began to understand that Cameron's silence hadn't been emptiness, but rather a kind of protective hibernation. He had been storing up observations, emotions, and connections, waiting for the right moment and the right person to share them with. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon in August. Elena had been telling Cameron about the monarch butterflies that migrated through Guadalajara each winter, how they covered the trees so completely that the branches seemed to shimmer with living gold. "Like bubbles," Cameron said thoughtfully, "but they don't pop." "No," Elena agreed. "They fly away and come back." Cameron was quiet for a long moment, his pencil moving across paper with unusual focus. Finally, he held up his drawing, a tree covered not with butterflies but with bubbles, each one containing a tiny figure. "People I miss," Cameron said, pointing to individual bubbles. They don't pop either. They just go where I can't see them. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. In the largest bubble, clearly recognizable despite the simple lines, was a woman with long hair floating in water. "To Mama?" Eleanor whispered. Cameron nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, but not overwhelmed by them. "I dream about her sometimes. She's in a bubble and I can see her, but I can't touch her." Eleanor set down her mending and opened her arms. Cameron came to her without hesitation, settling against her side with the trust of a child who had found someone who understood his particular language of grief. "Maybe," Elena said carefully, "the people we miss are always with us, not in bubbles, but in here." She placed her hand gently over his heart. Cameron considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "Even when I can't see them?" "Especialmente when you can't see them," Elena replied. "That's when you have to look with this." She tapped his chest again over his heart. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the garden. Elena found herself thinking about Diego, wondering if he remembered the stories she used to tell him, if he still thought about the woman who sang him lullabies in Spanish and kissed his scraped knees better. "Elena," Cameron said suddenly, using her name for the first time since they'd met. "Sí, mijo. Will you teach me the words, the Spanish ones?" Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she'd kept locked for years. "What words do you want to learn?" Cameron thought for a moment. "The ones that sound like home." Over the following weeks, their afternoon sessions took on a new dimension as Elena began teaching Cameron basic Spanish words and phrases. Not formal lessons, neither of them had the patience for textbooks and grammar rules, but organic learning that grew out of their daily interactions. "Burbuja," Elena would say as they prepared the bubble solution, and Cameron would repeat it back with careful pronunciation. "Cielo," when they watched bubbles float upward. "Hermoso," when Cameron showed her a particularly detailed drawing. "Te quiero," when Elena helped him clean up his art supplies at the end of each afternoon. Cameron absorbed the new language with the same intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. Within a month, he could conduct entire conversations in a mixture of English and Spanish that felt natural and unforced. More importantly, the Spanish seemed to unlock something in Cameron's emotional expression. He could say things in Elena's language that felt too vulnerable or too complex for English. He could be playful in Spanish in ways that English didn't seem to accommodate. "Elena, mira!" he would call out when he created a particularly impressive bubble, his voice carrying excitement that rarely appeared in his English speech. Elena would look and respond with enthusiasm that matched his own, and in those moments she felt like she was getting pieces of her own life back. The part of herself that had been Diego's mother, that had found joy in a child's discoveries, that had believed in her own worth as measured by love rather than documentation status or employment category. But she also felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Cameron was attaching to her in ways that went beyond their bubble rituals or Spanish lessons. He was beginning to look to her for the kind of emotional security that should have come from family. Elena had been down this road before with other families, other children. She knew how these stories ended when people like her became too important to people like them. The reminder came sooner than she'd expected. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of Mrs. Chen's increasingly pointed observations about Elena's expanded role in the household. The house manager had been politely neutral when Marcus first suggested Elena spend more time with Cameron, but as the weeks passed and the arrangement became more established, her disapproval grew harder to ignore. "The boy depends too much on her," Mrs. Chen mentioned during a Monday morning staff meeting that Elena wasn't invited to but heard about through the kitchen staff. "It's not healthy for a child to be so attached to temporary help." Elena tried to dismiss the comment as workplace jealousy. She'd seen it before when cleaning staff were given special consideration by employers. But Mrs. Chen's words carried the weight of someone who'd managed wealthy households for decades and understood the unspoken rules that governed relationships between employers and employees. The second sign came from Cameron himself, though he was unaware of the message he was sending. They were sitting in the garden on a particularly warm afternoon, Cameron working on what had become his most ambitious art project, a detailed series of drawings documenting the life cycle of soap bubbles from formation to dissolution. Elena was teaching him the Spanish names for different stages of the process when he suddenly looked up with the direct gaze that always signaled an important question. "Elena, are you going to live here forever?" Elena felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean, Mijo?" "Like Mrs. Chen," Cameron explained matter-of-factly. "She has the apartment over the garage. She's been here since before I was born. Are you going to stay that long too?" Elena struggled to find words that were honest, but not devastating. "I don't know, Cameron. That's not how my job works." "But it could work that way," Cameron pressed, with the logical persistence that made him such an engaging child and such a challenge to parent. "Daddy could ask you to stay. He could give you an apartment too." The innocence in his voice broke Elena's heart. At 7, Cameron couldn't understand the complex dynamics that made such arrangements impossible, the immigration status that kept Elena perpetually vulnerable, the class differences that made her dispensable no matter how much value she provided, the way wealthy families could discard help when convenience turned to complication. "Mi amor," Elena said gently, "some things are more complicated than they seem." But Cameron's mind had already latched onto the possibility. For the rest of their afternoon together, he talked excitedly about showing Elena more of the house, about teaching her to use the library, about introducing her to his father's collection of first-edition books. Elena listened with growing unease, recognizing the signs of a child constructing elaborate fantasies about a future that couldn't exist. She'd seen Diego do the same thing, spinning dreams about the life they'd build together once she got her papers sorted out, once she found a better job, once the system started making sense. That evening, after Cameron had gone to bed, Elena found herself walking restlessly around her small apartment, trying to shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a familiar cliff. The third sign arrived by certified mail. Elena stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, recognizing the logo of the law firm that handled Marcus Ashworth's personal affairs. Inside was a formal job offer, not for cleaning services, but for the position of family companion for Cameron Ashworth. The salary was generous, nearly triple what she made from her various cleaning jobs combined. The benefits were comprehensive. The job description was vague, but clearly designed to formalize what she'd already been doing with Cameron. Eleanor read through the documents twice, then set them on her kitchen table and made herself a cup of tea while she tried to process the implications. This was everything she'd thought she wanted when she first started working for wealthy families: recognition, security, the chance to build a relationship with a child that went beyond the transactional. But she'd learned enough about the world to recognize the strings that would come attached to such an offer. Family companion wasn't a real job title. It was a category created specifically to manage her relationship with Cameron, to give the household's emotional dependency on her a legal framework while maintaining clear boundaries about her place in the family structure. She would be essential, but not equal. Valued, but not secure. Close enough to love Cameron, but distant enough to be dismissed if circumstances changed. Eleanor had lived this story before, in different houses with different children. She knew how it ended. The next morning she arrived at the Ashworth estate with the unsigned contract in her bag and a decision weighing heavily on her heart. Cameron met her at the garden gate with his usual enthusiasm, chattering in Spanish about a new bubble technique he wanted to try. His joy at seeing her was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Elena felt her resolve waver, even as she strengthened it. They spent their morning as usual, bubbles and Spanish lessons and the comfortable rhythm they'd built together. But Elena found herself memorizing details, the way Cameron's forehead wrinkled when he concentrated on pronunciation, the unconscious gesture he made with his left hand when describing something important, the particular shade of contentment that settled over his features when he successfully communicated a complex idea in Spanish. After lunch, when Cameron was absorbed in sketching a new series of bubble formations, Elena walked to Marcus's office and knocked on the door. "Come in," he called, looking up from his computer with the distracted expression of someone deep in financial projections. Elena placed the unsigned contract on his desk and sat in the chair across from him. Marcus glanced at the papers, then back at her face, reading her expression with the skill that had made him successful in business. "You're saying no. I'm saying this isn't what Cameron needs," Elena replied, choosing her words carefully. "And it isn't what I can give him." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with new attention. "Explain that to me." Elena had rehearsed this conversation during her sleepless night, but sitting in his office, looking at the family photographs that lined his desk, the words felt heavier than she'd expected. "Cameron is healing," she said, "but he's healing because he found someone who could see his grief and sit with it, not try to fix it. Someone who wasn't afraid of his silence." Marcus nodded slowly. "But now he wants more than I can give him. He wants a mother figure, a permanent family member, someone who will never leave him." Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "I am not that person. I cannot be that person." "Because of your immigration status?" Marcus asked bluntly. Elena met his eyes. "Because I have already lost a child, and I cannot survive losing another one." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than any formal explanation could have provided. Marcus absorbed this information with the stillness of someone processing a fundamental shift in understanding. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Most people don't need to know," Elena replied. "But Cameron sees everything. He knows I understand his grief because I carry my own." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window toward the garden where his son was creating art from soap and air and hope. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked. Eleanor had thought about this too, had weighed the options against what she knew about children and loss and the delicate architecture of healing. "I stay until school starts," she said. 6 more weeks. I teach him that good things can end without being destroyed, that he can love someone and let them go and still carry what they gave him. And then? Then you help him find his next teacher, maybe a tutor who speaks Spanish, maybe an art instructor who understands how creativity helps with grief, maybe just a friend his own age who likes bubbles. Marcus studied her face, perhaps looking for signs that this decision was negotiable. "This will hurt him," he said. "Yes," Elena agreed, "but losing people we love is part of life. Learning how to love and let go, that's a skill he'll need." "And you? What happens to you after 6 weeks?" Elena had asked herself the same question. "I go back to my other jobs, I save money, I keep looking for my son." She paused. "I keep what Cameron has given me too." Marcus picked up the contract and set it aside. 6 weeks then. But I want to do something for you. College tuition, job training, help with legal status, something that matters." Elena shook her head. "Cameron has already given me what I needed." "Which is?" "The chance to be someone's teacher again. The chance to matter to a child." Elena's voice grew soft. "For 8 years, I have been invisible. Cameron made me real." That afternoon, Elena told Cameron about the 6-week timeline, explaining it in the gentle, matter-of-fact tone she'd learned to use for difficult truths. Cameron listened with the gravity he brought to all serious conversations, asking careful questions and absorbing her answers with the resilience that never failed to amaze her. "Will you write me letters?" he asked. "If you want me to." "Will you teach me more Spanish words?" "As many as we can fit into 6 weeks." "Will you remember me when you're taking care of other people?" Eleanor knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Millo. You are unforgettable. You are in my heart forever, whether I see you or not." Cameron nodded solemnly, then brightened with an idea that was purely 7 years old. "Can we make the biggest bubble ever, before you go?" "Por supuesto," Elena laughed. "Of course." The 6 weeks passed with the strange quality of time that is both endless and too brief, each day stretched full with intentional moments, yet the overall passage felt accelerated, as if the calendar were conspiring against them. Elena and Cameron threw themselves into their remaining time with the dedication of scholars approaching a final exam. The Spanish lessons intensified, moving beyond vocabulary into songs and stories, and the kind of wordplay that makes language feel like home. Cameron's pronunciation improved dramatically, but more importantly, his comfort with expressing complex emotions in Spanish grew into something that felt natural and unforced. Me siento triste, pero también agradecido, he told Elena one afternoon when she asked him how he was feeling about their upcoming separation. I feel sad, but also grateful. Elena smiled at the sophistication of his emotional vocabulary. ¿Por qué agradecido? Porque me enseñaste que puedo amar a alguien y dejarlo ir sin perder lo que me dieron. Because you taught me that I can love someone and let them go without losing what they gave me. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, amazed at how well this child understood lessons it had taken her decades to learn. Their bubble experiments also reached new levels of ambition. Cameron had become obsessed with creating the perfect giant bubble, and Elena had researched techniques and recipes until they had developed what they privately called the ultimate mixture, a combination of corn syrup, glycerin, and dish soap that produced bubbles of remarkable size and durability. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when all conditions aligned perfectly. Minimal wind, optimal humidity, and the kind of focused patience that comes from knowing time is precious. Cameron dipped the large loop they'd constructed from coat hangers and string, lifted it carefully and with a breath so gentle it was barely perceptible, created a bubble the size of a basketball. It floated serenely across the garden, catching the morning light like a small planet made of rainbow film. Elena and Cameron watched in awed silence as it drifted higher, cleared the garden wall, and disappeared toward the bay. It's going to find other bubbles, Cameron said with quiet satisfaction. Como sabes? Elena asked. Because that's what beautiful things do. They find each other. Elena added this moment to her growing collection of Cameron observations that were wise beyond their years. Marcus, meanwhile, had been quietly making arrangements for the transition. He'd hired a Spanish tutor, a retired teacher named Carmen, who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. He'd also enrolled Cameron in an art class at the community center, taught by a sculptor who had developed techniques for helping students express grief through creative work. Most importantly, he'd been having conversations with Cameron about the different kinds of love and connection that existed in the world, preparing him for the reality that people could be important to each other without being permanently available to each other. Eleanor will always be your friend, Marcus explained during one of their increasingly frequent father-son talks. But friends sometimes live in different places and see each other in different ways. Cameron had absorbed these concepts with his characteristic thoughtfulness, asking questions that demonstrated both his emotional intelligence and his acceptance of the situation's complexity. Will I love Carmen the teacher the same way I love Elena? He asked. No, Marcus replied honestly. Each person we love is different, and we love them differently, but that doesn't make any of the love less important. Cameron considered this. Like how I love you differently than I loved Mama, but I still love you both completely. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Exactly like that. As Elena's final week approached, she found herself struggling with her own emotions in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd been so focused on helping Cameron learn to let go that she'd underestimated how difficult it would be for her to practice the same skill. Cameron had become more than just a reminder of what she'd lost with Diego. He'd become his own person in her heart, funny, thoughtful, endlessly curious, and possessed of a gentle wisdom that made conversations with him feel like exchanges between equals rather than adult-child interactions. She would miss his excitement over new Spanish phrases, his artistic interpretations of everyday moments, his way of finding profound meaning in simple experiences. She would miss being needed by someone who appreciated her particular combination of skills and understanding. But she would also miss the version of herself that existed in relationship to Cameron, the teacher, the cultural guide, the person whose own experiences of loss had become resources for healing rather than just sources of pain. Elena had forgotten that grief could be transformed into gift, that survival could become service, that the things that had broken her could also become the tools she used to help others mend. On the last Thursday of her extended employment, Elena arrived early to find Cameron already in the garden, but not in his usual spot. Instead, he was standing in the center of the patio, next to an easel that held a canvas she hadn't seen before. As she approached, Elena realized it was a painting, not a drawing this time, but a full-color artwork that must have taken him weeks to complete in secret. The image showed a woman and a boy standing in a garden, but they were rendered as if they were inside a giant soap bubble. The bubble itself was transparent except for the rainbow patterns that swirled across its surface, and through the translucent walls, Elena could see a landscape that looked like a combination of the Ashworth Garden and the plaza in Guadalajara that she'd described in her stories. At the bottom of the canvas, in careful lettering that mixed English and Spanish, Cameron had written, "Para Elena, mi maestra de burbujas y corazones." For Elena, my teacher of bubbles and hearts. Elena stared at the painting, overwhelmed by its beauty and by the sophisticated emotional understanding it represented. Cameron had somehow captured the essence of their relationship, the way they had existed together in a protective sphere of understanding, separate from the rest of the world, but still connected to the larger landscape of their respective histories and hopes. "It's for you to keep," Cameron said, watching her reaction with nervous excitement. "So you remember that we were inside something beautiful together." Elena knelt down and pulled him into a hug that conveyed everything she couldn't find words for: gratitude, love, pride, sorrow, and the kind of deep recognition that passes between people who have truly seen each other. "Te voy a recordar para siempre," she whispered into his hair. "I will remember you forever." "Yo también," Cameron whispered back. Eleanor hung Cameron's painting on the wall of her new apartment, a one-bedroom unit in Oakland that she could afford thanks to the generous severance Marcus had insisted on providing. The painting had pride of place above her small dining table, where she could see it every morning as she drank her coffee and prepared for her day. She'd kept her word about the letters. Every 2 weeks, Elena wrote to Cameron in Spanish, telling him about her life, asking about his art and his Spanish lessons with Carmen, sharing observations about the world that she thought he might find interesting. Cameron wrote back with equal regularity, his letters growing more sophisticated as his Spanish improved. He told her about his friendship with a boy in his art class who also liked bubbles. He described the sculpture he was working on, a bronze piece that captured bubbles in metal, making them permanent. He shared the dreams he still had about his mother, which had evolved from scenes of loss to memories of joy. Elena, his most recent letter had said, "Creo que estoy listo para amar a otras personas sin olvidarte. I think I'm ready to love other people without forgetting you." Elena had smiled when she read that line, recognizing both the growth it represented and the echo of her own words from months earlier. She'd been right about Cameron's resilience, about his capacity to transform loss into strength. But she'd been wrong about one thing. She had thought that leaving him would feel like losing Diego all over again. Instead, it felt like finding a piece of Diego that she'd thought was lost forever, the part of herself that could love a child completely and then trust that love to continue existing even when the daily expressions of it had to end. Eleanor had started volunteering at a community center that served immigrant families, teaching Spanish to children who were losing their first language and English to parents who were struggling to connect with their American-born children. The work was familiar in the best way, helping people find the words to express what lived in their hearts. Last week, she'd received an unexpected phone call from a lawyer in Sacramento. They'd found Diego, now 29 years old, married, father to a 3-year-old daughter named Sophia. Diego had been looking for Elena too. The foster family that had raised him after her deportation had been kind people who had encouraged his curiosity about his birth mother and supported his search for her once he became an adult. They would meet next month in a coffee shop halfway between Oakland and Sacramento. Elena wasn't naive enough to expect an instant restoration of the relationship they'd lost, but she was hopeful enough to believe that they might build something new together, a connection based on who they'd become rather than what they'd been forced to leave behind. She'd learned from Cameron that love could be permanent even when circumstances were temporary, that healing could happen in unexpected ways, through unexpected people, in the time it took for a soap bubble to float from one person's breath to another person's wonder. Eleanor kept a bottle of bubble solution on her kitchen counter now, not for any particular purpose, but as a reminder of the magic that could emerge from the simplest materials when combined with intention and hope. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would step onto her apartment balcony and blow bubbles into the Oakland twilight, watching them catch the last rays of sun as they drifted toward the bay. She liked to imagine that somewhere in Marin County, a boy who spoke fluent Spanish and created art from memory and light was watching bubbles from his own garden, remembering the woman who had taught him that beautiful things don't have to last forever to be permanent. The language of light, Elena had learned, was written in moments, brief, brilliant, and eternal all at once, like soap bubbles carrying wishes to heaven, like the love between a woman and a boy who taught each other that healing could be both a solitary journey and a shared gift. Like all the best stories, theirs had no real ending, just a transformation from one kind of beauty to another, floating forward into whatever light was waiting to receive it. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe. It means the world to us. Like if Elena and Cameron's journey moved you, share with someone who needs hope today. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories that celebrate human connection across all boundaries. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey.